we're having a workshop for young researchers on the study of cooperatives, and it's an international group that came together to learn a little bit about also different methods that can be applied to study cooperatives. I would like to give the floor to our panelists now, just to introduce yourself and also how maybe, how do you relate with QCA, or why are you sitting on the panel?
You can start.
Yeah, you can start. You can also talk without the microphone.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Margitta, for invitation. Thanks, Professor Hanisch and Jens as well. That we work together at currently at the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research, which is located in Müncheberg, about 50 kilometers from Berlin. And if I talk about this QCA and my expertise, I did my PhD here at Humboldt-Universität in Berlin in the Division of Resource Economics under Professor Konrad Hagedorn. And when I joined to Humboldt, it was not clear which methods that I would use because I wanted to understand the collective action dilemma in the irrigation sector in post-socialist Uzbekistan, in Central Asia. I found in the empirical cases that there were still huge problems with irrigation, a lot of unmaintained canals, in the territories of these organizations. And then it raised to me the question of under which conditions these associations would collaborate, would cooperate. So that was my initial point for the research. And then first I wanted to understand the whole system. So I employed the typical qualitative research. So I went to the field, I tried to understand the system itself, and try to come up with some indicators. So once I developed using these theories, collective action theory, common pool resources, and then initially I had designed it in such a way that, for example, just before going to the field, I had the QCA training in Ljubljana. There is a summer school on QCA. So it's every summer in July or in August you can apply. I would highly recommend to also to visit it. So that also together with Professor Thiel and also Matteo and myself, so we visited this QCA just to understand what QCA gives to you. So just wanted to understand what are the options on the methods that we could use, because the dilemma came with one, because my unit of analysis or the system that I was studying is about the water user associations. So, and then I understood that with one water user associations you cannot explain much because it's a very small territories and few farmers. And then I wanted to understand why in certain associations this cooperation work, in certain it doesn't work. And then so in the field I visited several associations to understand it. And then once I had some ideas, when I came back, so there was this dilemma how we can, how I can compare these cases. So then this idea of with Professor Hagedorn and Andreas Thiel said, okay, why not to use some advanced methodologies like QCAs, for example. And then I said, okay, it's interesting. I looked at the literature, and then so suddenly this came, the opportunity in Ljubljana, and I had the opportunity to visit for 2 weeks to really understand from the ground what is actually, what are the advantages, what are the limitations of these methods. And then I went to the field again with already some designed, let's say pre-designed my conditions. Okay, what could be, once I had the first exploratory field visit, and then I designed based on what I've learned in the during this summer school. And yeah, then I went to the field, and obviously I had to also revise at the end all my conditions, but my outcome was the same, so I wanted to understand under which conditions the farmers would cooperate. So the outcome was the maintenance of irrigation canals in my case. And yeah, then so I had 15 cases with water user associations and with 3 conditions. Initially I had a lot of conditions, but as you know, maybe you learned that with the QCA it's a bit problematic if you have so many conditions, because you end up with so-called these arithmetic reminders and then so I had to kind of group them and kind of using which I think Professor Hanisch, you would know, the Speer, Johanna, I think, so using her also, yeah, calibration paper, so I had to calibrate the QCA, and eventually, yeah, together with Dimitris and Professor Thiel, so we were successful to publish this in the Environmental Science and Policy paper.
I would like to invite Claas to also introduce himself.
Myself and also the research already, or just myself?
Yeah, also the research already. Okay. I think now we're...
Okay, I'm Claas Meyer. I'm also from the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research in Müncheberg, and I did my PhD within a junior research group funded by socio-ecological research by the research ministry. So, and in this course, when I started with this research group, we did a lot of different trainings on different methods, and that was where I got the first contact with QCA, because we did I don't know, 2 or 3 days QCA training, and I liked the method very much because of its, I don't know, simplicity. But I had, at the beginning, I had no idea how to use, and we had 1 year to find our way for this PhD and write a proposal. So at the beginning I had just the method, and then our research group was on payments for ecosystem services, mainly on payments for ecosystem services initiated by civil society, but I had the government part, so my PhD was on the governmental payments for ecosystem services, and I mainly looked at agri-environmental measures in the US and Germany. And my PhD was composed out of different papers and very different works, and just one of this was done with the QCA at the end. And I was also, on the other hand, I was really influenced by this book of, how is his name? Jan Monsees, I don't know if you know it, and it's about comparative institutional analysis. I liked it very much, and so at the end, for one of the works for the PhD, I put these ideas of a comparative institutional analysis together with the ideas of QCA, and wanted to do this for agri-environmental measures. So for this paper, I analyzed different agri-environmental measures in Germany, and the institutional setup related to the success of the measures. So that was the basic idea, to look if certain combinations of institutions are relevant for the success of the measures. We published this paper in the Journal of Environmental Management. And we had 50 cases, 50 different agri-environmental measures in 5 German federal states. And we reduced, I think, I don't remember, I think we had like 9 conditions, and we reduced them also to 5. I think we had really good results with 5 conditions.
I think it might be also very interesting to know how you came up with your conditions. Like, did you only draw on theory, or Ahmad already said he had this explanatory phase where he already, maybe was introduced to different cases and saw what is going on. So it might be interesting to elaborate on that a little bit more.
I basically draw back on literature. So we screened literature in this area, literature on agri-environmental measures and which conditions can be relevant for the success of the success in terms of environmental effectiveness, I have to say. And this the success conditions, so the how do you say? Sorry? The success condition was a really difficult thing, I think, because the literature describes very well which aspects could be relevant for the success of such measures in terms of environmental effectiveness. So it was more the success condition which was difficult to determine, and beside the literature study, I think at ZALF and at my working group, there's a lot of expertise on certain conditions which can lead to successful agri-environmental measures in terms of environmental effectiveness, because they worked long time on outcome-based measures, and for example, they did the midterm evaluation of the agri-environmental measures 2 periods back, so there was some knowledge on what could be relevant, but the paper is basically, also the conditions of the paper are basically from literature.
Yeah.
Maybe can I just interrupt, just because I also read your paper, and just for you to know, you were using CRISP-set QCA,
yes,
right? And you collected your data using questionnaires, and then also some telephone interviews or something.
Yeah, if there were some questions on the evaluation of the conditions, we did telephone interviews with the relevant people in the administration. So we sent questionnaires to the people who are programming the. Are you familiar with agri-environmental measures? No, okay. So that are payment programs. So the state is paying farmers for manage their land environmentally friendly. So there are governmental administrations who are programming these instruments, designing these instruments, and there are certain people who are responsible for the design of these instruments. And so we send a questionnaire to them to ask them if certain conditions. So we asked them if the conditions are included in the instrument, and they just had the possibility to answer dichotomously. So they have to could say yes, this rule is included or it's not included. And we always, for each measure, we ask the relevant person in the administration who was designing the agri-environmental measure. So in the agri-environmental measures, basically they are paid, the farmers are paid to do certain things with their land, to put buffer strips or other things.
Okay, I think there was also some important knowledge before we maybe continue. Ahmad, do you maybe want to elaborate how you developed your conditions?
Yes. As I said, so I had this exploratory field visit first to the field, and there I used this collective action theory in order to understand this socio-ecological systems. And yeah, then when I came back, for example, after discussing it, it was an iterative process in mind. So it was not just, okay, designing one and it works perfectly until the end. So I had to revise my conditions. I had to kind of design the new conditions, for example. So when I interviewed all those also associations, let's say, or the groups, so I found that it didn't work out for me. So I had to come back and I had to design again the conditions based on the second field trip. So I ended up like 3 times to change my, to revise my conditions in order to really explain what was going on in the field, because it's it was a more empirical cases, and so it was very complex system in order to understand this the whole phenomenon.
for my case, if you want to define policies as successful or unsuccessful, it's really hard to find certain. It's really hard to find certain condition, a way to define them as successful or unsuccessful. That was a real problem, to find certain variables to say that they are effective or not effective, the policies.
Since we're already talking about the case selection, and you already mentioned that you need some kind of variability, you need good cases, you need bad or unsuccessful cases. I think still the cases, they have to share some kind of characteristics, or they have to have some in common so that you can still compare them. And how did you do this?
In my case, it was maybe easier because as they are policy instruments, they follow basically the same rules. So you have always a similar characteristic they follow. So and I applied this characteristics they follow. So it was quite easy. I think in your case it was more difficult.
Yes, I would not say quite different or quite difficult as well, because I was because I looked at the information, and throughout, for example, Uzbekistan, let's say, there were, I think, I'm not sure, but more than 2,000 such organizations, let's say. And then, so I had to narrow down in order exactly to keep some of the variables constant. Otherwise, you cannot learn it, because if there are too many heterogeneity, then there might be also difficulty with the conditions. And so then I had to select. I had to be very quite specific first with the region, let's say. So I would take one specific region within the country where, for example, climatic conditions are quite similar, so that I can control the climate, for example, characteristics, as well as, for example, looking at the ethnicity, because throughout the country there are very different ethnic groups. So I had to also to narrow down it to ethnicity, you know, and I ended up, let's say, those who have share the similarities across some of the variables, around 120 cases, let's say. So out of this 120 cases, which share more or less some of the similar characteristics, so I had to then, based on some of the conditions, I had to select, so it came up to 15 cases. So yeah, indeed, it's very important when you select the cases. It's not really heterogeneous. Otherwise, you will end up with so many conditions that can explain the outcome. So for me, for example, the most similar cases design approach was very useful in order to select my cases, so that it keeps some of the conditions quite constant. Yeah, as such, I also selected my cases.
How difficult is it to put this kind of information and the theories into, for example, a model? Or did you, for example, formulate a QCA solution in advance that you were thinking that you might find when applying the QCA? Or was this also rather an iterative process?
Yeah, it was it's a good question, and I think I don't have a very precise answer. It's an iterative process, I would say. First, I did not use any models, so that's why for me it was a bit different. I combined with traditional qualitative research, so really to go and to really understand with the individual farmers, with the individual association members, and with the experts, with the governmental officials. And then once I kind of designed these possible explanations of why this is, let's say, this is not success and this is success. And then I went to design the QCA. And along the way, so during the analysis, I had to also kind of course, it's a process. I mean, you cannot say, okay, you choose one solution in advance and you follow this solution. And for example, getting into the training, and then there was also follow-up, I would say, in Frankfurt, I guess, this QCA applications. There is this Goethe Institute in Frankfurt. They have also, I think, QCA courses. They quite often organize. So I was able to also and to discuss my results with them as well. So then I had to, again, once you discuss with the experts there, once you present there, then they might say, oh, here is your problem, here is your, you know, and I think my suggestion would be also when you start with the QCA, I mean, don't afraid, you share among yourself, especially with the colleagues who have applied or who are in the a bit advanced stage, who can support you or who can give you some feedback on that. So it was really helpful for me to get the feedback from the, let's say, experts, from colleagues.
I had the assumption that one of these 9 conditions or combinations of these conditions could be relevant for the success. So that was a kind of assumption. I just formulated that combinations of these conditions, but I didn't hypothesize on certain combinations. So yeah, that would be a really advanced step, I would say. But it's all about combinations with QCA, because everything else you can find out in a different way. Like the interesting thing with QCA is that you find out these combinations of conditions, I would say. So that was, for me, this was the interesting thing with QCA, that I got the combinations leading to a certain result.
If we already talk about the solutions, once you received your solution, like let's say the first time you were super happy, you produced all your raw data, your table looked perfect, you put it into your respective software and you received the solution, like what happened? Let's start writing the paper. Yeah? No?
No, I don't remember actually, but I know that the first times I put data in the tool and I calculated it, then I was, oh, what's that? What's coming out? And then I had to think about it and refine it. And so it was hard work, I would say.
And Ahmad, how was it for you the first time you ran your QCA?
Yeah, that's again in my case it was. So once I found, okay, okay, here are the results, and what I did is to present in the conferences. And I remember when I presented the results and they said, so what? I mean, what's new? Because I said, okay, this is a combination, so that's important, you know, to understand the whole system, because you always say, okay, this is an important indicator, for example, but when it comes to the combination, you don't know this, you know. Fully, I agree, it's a very iterative process, so you have to also take this into account. And then I had to go to my qualitative information, I had to check, and I discussed with then in Frankfurt with some experts, and then I had to also look at and take into account, I remember some of the conditions and refine the conditions.
And you have already mentioned the solutions, and we already started discussing this before. So once you got your solutions, I think you included your complex and the parsimonious solution, right, Claas? Or you reported both of them? Yeah. And then you have to explain what is written there in the solutions. And I think that's also quite a step that is maybe not that, I think people might not realize that it's also very difficult to explain what you find with a solution. And how did you approach this?
I discussed a lot. I had 2 colleagues with whom I worked on that a lot. that was really nice. So and it worked out really good, I have to say, to interpret the solutions and also the relation between the parsimonious and the complex ones. So because I compared them in a way, but it was really it was a long-lasting discussion process, I would say, in my case.
I would fully agree. This is always this iterative process. As I said, you discuss with your colleagues, and especially I also had the opportunity to work with the QCA experts, let's say. So we had to discuss with them about the solutions, and it was a very tough and very long decision, let's say, which solution to base on, and the interpretation of the results as well.
Okay, so I think that maybe you also have some questions that you want to ask Claas and Ahmad. So I would also give you the opportunity to ask them. So we have the question why you chose 50 cases, which is actually quite a large number for QCA compared to what other people have published maybe. And then the question about the comparability of the cases which are maybe located in different regions, and once you have received a solution, how it applies also to all regions, like how you can generalize probably from what you find.
Yes. The second question, but this design rules which are used as conditions, or the conditions, they were really general, so they are applicable in every federal state, because they are really basic building blocks of this agri-environmental measures, which are again basically determined by EU law, which applies to all federal states in the same way. So I think that was not the problem. Maybe so it's not federal state dependent, I would say. These ones I used, there are maybe other conditions which could be also, that's what I meant. You could have gone more in detail and based on more qualitative inquiry, and maybe you could have found other conditions that could be also relevant for the success of this measures. But I would say the conditions I used are really general conditions for the design of such kind of policy measures.
So the question is, if you collect data at individual level or through focus group discussions, how can you ensure that you, or how can you analyze at the level of an organization, for example? How can you connect those?
So in my case, it was I did not only employ the QCA, so I had to also I also employed different methods to analyze the cases. But in the QCA, it was only at the organization level, at the focus group discussion level. So what I did is, once I collected from 15 cases, so I put into so-called this Atlas TI software in order to generate most commonly discussed topics, let's say most commonly discussed, because in the Atlas TI it can give you the structure, or which are the important aspects, for example. And then from that, once I developed so-called this taxonomy of activities, what are the important points that were discussed during the focus group discussions, then I designed the most common 3, let's say, conditions in order to really better understand whether this only indicator would explain this phenomenon, or when it comes with the combinations. So it was not only the QCA which I applied in my case. First, I wanted to understand, to generate the whole activities, the whole taxonomy for using the Atlas TI tool, and then to go into the detail under which conditions, for example, these 3 conditions would explain why this is happening in certain organizations, why this is not happening in certain organizations.
So I think the question is, do you find something new with the QCA when you have your solution, or is it something that you might have expected from the beginning? Yeah, something like this. Yeah.
Let me try to get it. I hope I will also get it correctly. So in my case, it was, as I said, it was iterative. So I just wanted to understand the system itself. So I did not have, of course, I had this theoretical assumption that these conditions would help me to explain the outcome. But when I went to the field, so I had to redesign with different conditions. So I wanted to explain that phenomenon in general, yeah. And I did not, of course, you have to have some assumptions in advance that it could also help you, you know, to narrow down your path, let's say. But so it ended up, in my case, let's say, not what I had employed, but with different conditions to explain this phenomenon. So I was very open to capture all possible conditions. So I did not have the specific conditions that I tested. Okay. I had this, but it ended up on the field that it was not the right conditions to explain that phenomenon.
Claas, do you also want to respond to the question?
In my case, it was the combination of the conditions. I didn't had an idea before which combinations could be relevant. So, and at the end, I had some combinations which were sufficient for the success, or what I defined as success.
So, how did you reduce the number of your conditions, and according to which principles, maybe?
It's a difficult question, I would say. It's not because QCA is itself, it's very complex, and as I said. In my case, for example, I had to be also pragmatic, yeah, to be honest, because with a lot of conditions, you need a lot of cases, and with a lot of cases, you need a lot of resources, time, you know, all the, and then, yeah, I opted to 3 conditions in the beginning to really see whether it makes sense, and then when I went to the field with that condition, as I said, for example, mental models to explain. And then I see that it really doesn't fit into this. And then, yeah, using this, what I said earlier, this Atlas TI, so I had to predefine or refine, let's say, my main conditions that could explain it. But I agree, it's quite challenging as well to really find the right conditions, yeah, because especially if you study the social ecological system where you have so many indicators to explain the certain phenomena, and it is quite challenging. So, which means it's not a simple answer, yeah, for that. It's very challenging. I don't know, Claas.
I did 2 sets. I had a simple set. There I reduced the conditions, I think, to 5. But it's also written in the paper. I showed both, and if I remember right, we. For this simple set, we used such conditions which where the presence and absence of the condition were most evenly through in the cases. So that was, I think, that was one set, and in the other set we used all 9 conditions. But maybe you can have a look. I really don't remember. So. But this was the idea. But the results with this main conditions, which were where the absence and presence was even in these cases, the results were really good. So they were really showing something. So, but we presented both in the results.
How did you reduce your 2,000 cases from the beginning and narrow it down to 15 cases, and maybe give an example?
Yes. Very simply, for example, I read the paper, but because in the paper also it's explained. First, it's for the entire country, yeah, and so it was a secondary information. What I found, 2,000 associations, such associations exist, and then I had to select, which I said based on this most similar cases design were the climatic similarities, so that I could control some of the variables. So I had to select, for example, one region or one province, and then within the province I found that there are 5 different basins, and using the information, so I selected these 2 sharing basins. So as such, I already reduced to what I said, 120 cases around. And then some theories, some assumptions. For example, the theory said about the leadership. And when I read some literature, when there is a technocratic leader, for example, let's say those who have studied the engineering or the water or irrigation, so they could influence the outcome. And so I purposely selected those associations where they had such leaders, for example. And also, as I said, also I selected those cases where there were some donors did some activities. So I had a lot of secondary information before selecting the cases. So as such, I followed 5 or 6 steps how I came to this 15 associations. But it's a long process and it's challenging. But you could, you can have a look at it.
So did you use any robustness checks and, like for example, dropping one of your conditions to see how the solution changes?
So that's why I said it's a good point. So some of the why it's when I had to refine my conditions. It's because of it did not give me, as I said, it did not give me the full picture, full information. When I presented in the first conference, I said, okay, so what? So I had to go back because it was not that condition that would explain, for example, my outcome. And once I presented, once I discussed it, and I kind of refined my different conditions in the whole process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was how you, what kind of anchor points basically you used to measure the outcome of success.
Yes, thank you. And so I had to also to include some measures in order to come up to the outcome. One was, for example, whether the association collected enough money, because I found that several ways of maintaining the canals. One is so-called voluntary kind of get-together on the weekends, for example. They come, they clean the canal, and then another, those who do not have time, so they invest. It's a membership fee, for example. So, and yeah, the third I don't remember, but I had 3 different measures in order to come to the outcome, and then I calibrated that in order to come only into in the data matrix into one, let's say, number, yeah. But you have to explain, and I did explain in the paper as well how I came through this different process.
Maybe just to pick up a question that we had yesterday, because we were talking about the calibration and also the weighing and how you would aggregate your data to come to one condition in the fuzzy set also. And how did you do that? Like, how did you aggregate your conditions? And also we had the questions, what happens if the conditions correlate with each other? Is that a problem in the QCA or, yeah?
The first point, if I may, it's either based on the theory. For example, you calibrate it. For example, the theory says, in my case, yeah, where I had, for example, in each conditions, several measures. But at the end of the day, in order to run the QCA, you have to come up with a one number, let's say, in the data matrix, yeah. And so I use the theoretical and as well as my own empirical knowledge in order to come up. For example, one example, yeah, I could say in the leadership, I said, okay, either it's for example, I found 3 measures. One is a charismatic leader, another is an experienced leader, and the third is a technocratic leader. So within one condition of leadership, I had 3 measures. And then once I collected all the information, and within each, I had to come up with definitions. What is a charismatic leader? Yeah, you cannot say either charismatic or no charismatic. Yeah, so it's quite a long process, and and then I said, for example, when I read the literature, it's also looking at the field, my own experience. So then I calibrated either charismatic, where you use this or, I think, and technocratic and experienced. So which means that, for example, I put a lot of weight on the charismatic leaders, where you have either this charismatic leader or technocratic and, for example, experienced leader. And then it's quite simple, you know, to come up. For example, in the or, if I'm not mistaken, you choose the highest number. In the end, in between, you choose the lowest number. And then as such, you construct your data matrix. For example, in the one association, if I may say, the charismatic leader was 1, and experienced and, for example, technocratic leaders were 0.6. Yeah? And then it came into 1. When I calibrated, when I used this calibration in the data matrix under leadership, it came into 1. So that means that this is a good functioning association in terms of the leadership. But you have to be open, and you have to report this, also all this calibration transparently in the papers, how you came to this calibration.
Yeah, you see a lot of designing or structuring with a QCA, engineering as a QCA researcher, so to say. Do we have another question, or otherwise I would, or
yeah, I could add.
okay,
I
sure.
wanted to add something to the outcome. So what I used the framework by MICVITS to decide on the efficiency or effectiveness of the policy measures. So I like this, and I think it's applicable to, or you can make it applicable to different. If you look at policy measures, it's a useful one, I would say. It's MICVITS 2004.
So the question was if after having applied the QCA and also learned how to manage the QCA, would you apply it again for next research? And for my question, just to add on that, would be, what would you do different if you applied again? Is there something that you have learned from the past that you would maybe like to share with people who are at the beginning of using the QCA, what to do different, or, yeah?
I think it can be really elegant. I liked it from the beginning because it was when we were presented this method in this course. I really much liked it. So because it seemed to be really elegant and the results were really cool, and then when I applied it by myself, it was really a lot of work, and I'm not sure what I think. If you do qualitative research, it's a really good method to add a little bit on, especially if it's possible, and you have the data you need, and you have maybe also the time and the financial resources to do it. I think it's a good thing to add on to make a paper or research more valuable. Also, maybe for people who are used to quantitative research. I'm not sure if I would design a QCA study from the beginning again. So as I did this time, I think I would use QCA the next time if I see that it could be applicable in the case I'm working on, I would say. Yeah. Not I want to do a QCA and now I'm designing a QCA study. I wouldn't do it again, I think.
Okay. Exactly this point. Just before this meeting, we discussed it with some of your colleagues, that he was asking whether I'm still using QCA, because it was in the past I think it was in 2015 or 2014, and I said no, and he was like, why? I mean, so you recommend not to use QCA? I said no, I don't recommend not to use, but it all depends on your research design, yeah? If I'm not like taking the QCA and say I want to apply to everywhere, this QCA. If it makes sense in your research that QCA can explain something, this relationship, these combinations, then definitely I would also. At the moment, for example, in my current job, I'm not, because it's not relevant, or I don't see the applicability of this QCA. But when it comes to the research, for example, where you design as such that QCA can help you to better explain, yes, I would definitely consider it and apply this method.
And would you do something differently?
There is also one aspect I haven't explored, maybe it could be also useful. Maybe you also study this multi-value QCAs, which is very rarely applied, and where you have the three, I think, explanations or three values. Maybe it could be also useful. And with a fuzzy set, yes, again, if I have the resources, maybe to explore more conditions, more cases, in order to capture the whole complexity of the system.
I mean, it's, if you see it from outside, it's a really nice method for comparative institutional analysis, I would say. If you not have so many cases, and so if you have the cases and you have the data, I would say you can apply it. I would do it again.
Maybe one more thing from my side. Even though I'm not applying, but with Dimitrios Zikos, we are teaching here the QCA. Those who are interested in if you are at Humboldt, so we have this advanced methodology for socio-ecological system analysis, where we teach about the QCA here. So you could also participate, and there also we can discuss it. So I'm still involved with the QCA, yeah? It's not only...
And we are doing a special issue on methods for ecosystem service governance, and there we'll also do a paper on using QCA for comparative institutional analysis.
Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. We have learned a lot. I personally have learned a lot that also helps me with continuing with QCA. I'm already on the track of QCA, so I cannot jump off now. I will take it to the end, but I think it's somehow encouraging, and I think the way you also talked about it, it's still a very interesting method. And I think you both learned a lot through the whole process about not only about the topic that you're studying, but also how to do research and like to act, to engineer a whole research process, which I think is very different with QCA compared to other methods. So thank you very much, and also thank you for listening and your interesting questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.